The United Nations Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, says Sudan conflict threatens to consume the entire country. Thousands of malnourished children are at risk of dying as fighting between rival generals rages on. The conflict between the army under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces commanded by Mohammed Hamdan Daglo broke out on April 15. Well, for more on this, we're now joined by Will Carter, the country director of the Norwegian Refugee Council in Sudan. We'll appreciate your time this evening. Now, you've just come out of Sudan. Give us a narrative of how things stand for somebody who's been on the ground.
Thanks, Hugo. I mean, the situation in Sudan is devastating and dire. We've got almost 5 million people who have been forced to flee their homes, mostly from conflict and different types of violence, airstrikes, the whole capital city offline. Over 6 million people a step away from famine, and then basic services in the country really brought to its knees. The banking sector, the health sector, educational services, everything's sort of flatlining. So it's a really critical and desperate time. But I spent the last few months with our teams trying to respond to the situation. It's a highly traumatic event, what's happened. There's been conflicts in Sudan before, but nothing that's engulfed the country in quite the way this has.
Now, we talked about the humanitarian crisis in that introduction. Now, just to paint a picture for us of, just how bad is it? What we understand is that Sudan is not one of the richest countries, and neither are many of its neighbors. So it's almost going from the frying pan into the fire for many of these refugees.
Absolutely. The country was stable in some parts, clearly Darfur and other parts. When there was a secession with South Sudan, there were areas of conflict outside of the capital. But we had 1 million people, 1 million refugees inside this 45 million person country who sought safety there. It was somewhat stable, but that sanctuary's turned into a war zone itself, and we've had some of those refugees go back to the same conflict areas that they were fleeing from in the first place, and hundreds of thousands of Sudanese civilians, from the capital city and other cities, seeking safety in Egypt, seeking safety in Chad, and also most of them displaced to other parts of the country which just can't support them. So it's mind-blowing, really, the scale of what's happening, and just quite as quick as it is. We've gone from just maybe 3 or 4 million people in long-term displacement before, but we've had almost 5 million people newly displaced by pretty brutal conflict.
Now, Will, you're the country director of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Norway, obviously, a country in Europe, right? Now, what we know is that a year and a half ago, or almost a couple of years ago, there was a war started between Russia and Ukraine. And the amount of support that the West has given, in fact, Joe Biden has gone to Congress several times to appeal for more funding. Countries across the spectrum of Europe have come together to support this conflict. Just how much support has been given to Sudan, and from what you know, the rest of Africa in terms of conflict and catastrophic incidents such as this?
I mean, there's been a few appeals launched from the United Nations and from other aid organizations just to get survival assistance, really, to the huge scale of suffering. 1 in 2 people require some form of life-saving assistance, and we're really, got nickels and dimes back, to be frank, inside Sudan. We were requesting, to be honest, $2 billion for the whole aid operation, and perhaps less than 20% has been raised. So, there's people, many of them were refugees before they fled conflict. Some were already in pretty food insecure situations, and now this has happened, and it's heartbreaking, really, that there's just been such little movement, and not only with funding but also attention. The type of diplomacy required to manage this conflict and hopefully resolve it, so that we don't need all these humanitarian responses, that people get safety. The diplomatic attention is also not there. So we see a huge disparity between a massive humanitarian catastrophe unraveling in a region, and probably going to spill into other countries. South Sudan's not so stable. The rest of it's neighborhood. Chad, Libya, Ethiopia all have different challenges themselves, and then to receive hundreds of thousands of refugees and have economic and trade disruption and conflict risks as well. It's hugely destabilizing and a massive disparity in what we've seen from responses, financial but also diplomatic, to Ukraine versus what we see in Sudan and Africa.
Now, one of the things that we understand is that ethnic violence has emerged in the Western Darfur region. Can you elaborate on the impact of this violence on the affected communities and just how much more difficult it makes life for the Sudanese?
It's really terrible what's happening. In some ways, you've got 2 or 3 different wars breaking out. One is between the generals, the Sudanese armed forces, and a paramilitary force. But that's quite linked to ethnic violence on a massive scale, and we've seen mass violence or slaughters, to be honest, in various parts of the Darfur region. So even if there's a resolution between 2 generals, perhaps that saves the capital at some point, we might go back to the Darfur that was really publicized 10, 20 years ago or so and required a peacekeeping mission, which was concluded 2 or 3 years ago. It's terrifying, really. It's harrowing stories. Some of these events were happening since the peacekeeping mission finished in 2020, but the lid's been blown off, and it's total mayhem in parts of Darfur, and very little aid can get through right now. So it's imperative not only that the Khartoum, the capital situation, that constitutional crisis is resolved, but also that we look at relief aid and some kind of stability for Darfur.
Now, we understand, obviously, in Niger, where there's been conflict. In fact, there's been a coup recently, but ECOWAS, which is a grouping of countries within that region, has stepped in, and one thing that they're doing is they're imposing sanctions. So let's talk about the African Union, for instance, in your view. Are they doing enough? I mean, we've talked about the United Nations putting out an appeal, but where is the African Union when all of this is happening?
There's been interest from significant parts of the African Union and the other sort of regional body, IGAD, more for the sort of East Africa or Horn of Africa, and they've tried. I've seen statements come together quite quickly, quite strong actually, from President Ruto in Kenya, for example. Very quick to name what he feels is happening as tantamount to genocide. Very quickly reaching that conclusion, something we didn't perhaps see the last round of conflict. So that at least there's a posturing, but it's kind of left to the warring parties in Sudan, and at the moment they're kind of picking and choosing between who they want to mediate. Is it Egypt? Is it Kenya and IGAD? Is it Saudi Arabia and the US? Is it others? So I have seen offers for sure come from the African Union, but those offers have been rebuffed, and I think the question on everyone's lips is now, well, what next? Because this is going to become an unmanageable and intractable regional conflict or mess. And so if the UN and all the global geopolitics are very divided at the moment from Ukraine, and it's very difficult to get any resolutions through the Security Council anymore, how will the African Union and IGAD step up? And if they're not taking diplomacy, what next? So I think they need to expedite some of these talks and discussions. They've postured right, but it's not reaching the tempo and momentum that will meet the moment and the needs to resolve this and respond to this.
Now, Will, we mentioned a little while ago that you came out of Sudan recently. You're on your way back, I think, in the next short while. Let's talk about your own safety and certainly the safety of others who work for humanitarian organizations that are doing a huge amount to support these battered individuals in Sudan. Do you fear for your safety? How safe are you?
It's a war zone, and it's difficult to see how people can be kept safe from airstrikes, from ethnic violence. There's very little respect for international humanitarian law and the safety of aid workers at the moment and healthcare facilities. to be blunt. We're worried about the situation going back in. We've ourselves had a staff member killed, unfortunately. There's been 18, 19 other aid workers killed, and not to mention hundreds probably of volunteers from the Sudanese local communities who have been trying to provide relief, who have probably also been killed or detained. So it's a hugely dangerous situation. We're trying to get security assurances from all sides and the ability to cross different border crossings, getting in safely, also allowing people to safely leave, is one of our top issues at the moment. But at the moment, the system's disintegrating, so it's really tough. That aside, the humanitarian imperative to help people with life-saving assistance is also really critical. So it's a really stressful dilemma. We've got very brave staff, very dedicated staff. Not only is the personal risks that they face, but also the personal pressures that some of them haven't heard from their families. Some of them have families displaced or in isolated areas. And so it's a real testament. You see the worst of humanity and sometimes the best of humanity come out, both for the aid volunteers and staff within organizations like ours and UN agencies and other NGOs. But it's dangerous and it is tough.
Now, well, some of the individuals that suffer the most during situations such as this, where you have a war zone, are women and children. Now, whilst we talk about giving them humanitarian aid, the one area that I'd like us to focus on is what support is available in terms of grief and trauma for these individuals. It can only be traumatic, extremely traumatic at the very least for children, some who may see their parents die, who are starving and are going through all sorts of indescribable situations.
There's the material, physiological needs and also the psychosocial needs as well. And parts of the country have had conflict before people were already living in displacement, but also this was many millions of people came from a capital city where this is the first time. And, quite quickly it turned to airstrikes. Quite quickly it turned to, huge urban battles. Quite quickly there was shelling in the areas and they lost family members escaping. They're living in very uncertain conditions. So there was trauma, there's huge stress. Is the range of sort of mental health and well-being services available? Sure, absolutely not. There is some things going. For example, our own programs, we're very conscious of the experience that children face through this. So displaced girls, displaced boys, and in partnership with local educational authorities, we've been able to get teachers to look at programs like the summer school, in a sense, to help reestablish a sense of safety, a sense of normalcy, readjustment. But this is a very basic level, and there's really acute cases, and there's many hundreds of thousands of people who desperately need that type of service too.
And finally, what are the most pressing needs right now for humanitarian organizations working in Sudan? And how can individuals and governments around the world help? I mean, how can we all help as African citizens?
For sure, continental and regional leadership is required to resolve this. We can't see so much happening by itself from New York. So there's a huge, need for representatives and for governments to take this more, seriously. To be honest, I think everyone's kind of looking at each other. There's no ideas on the table, and no one's prepared to talk about the next steps that need to be taken. For the aid aspect, we need safety, as you say. People need safety too. So if there's no ceasefires, and there's been a lot of attempts to get proper ceasefires in place, that leads to respect for international law and to not target civilians, to reduce harm to civilians, to allow civilians safe passage to leave. For sure, that needs to be impressed by regional and leaders and other diplomatic missions to the warring parties and to their allies. Some of them are on the continent, and some of them in other regions, which are difficult for the global system to push on that. We need access. The Sudanese government needs to let visas, aid flow in through imports and through all border crossings, regardless of who controls it, to get to people regardless of their ethnicity. So we need diplomatic attention, and I think at the moment there's fatigue on the number of crises that have happened. So, really look to responsible African citizens to speak to their representatives to make sure this is a priority for their foreign policy going forward, because it will engulf a huge part of the continent, really, and it will be a major stain on our conscience, but also just be an unmanageable crisis at a time where no one can afford it and it's not ethical. So I think demand action and care and to be engaged on this topic is our sort of appeal to the good people of South Africa.
Well, appreciate your time this evening. We wish you peace and safety.